could attempt to answer the question, can invoking the cultural pride and the historical pride of the Adivasi population, can it put them into the forefront of being change makers and at the top pedestal of the country's leadership? Now, before I get into that, it's important for me to address my journey that leads me into, talking about this issue. As an author, I have had a checkered career, or rather prolific is the other word, where different books of mine have been reflective of the different stages or different phases of life that I was going through at a given point in time. So my first book, which came out in 2006, That Thing Called Love, was a contemporary story of complicated urban relationships. I think at 28 or 29 one would relate with that kind of scenario. My next book was a cricket thriller, 22 Yards. That was a time when I think a lot of Indians, after the 2007 World Cup defeat of India, had given up hopes on the Indian team and the way cricket was being administrated in the country. So it was a reflection of, it was a story of a cricket captain who was on the verge of playing his final match, and he gets to realize that the 3 of his team members are compromised and going to throw the match away. So it was a whodunit of the captain in a span of 36 hours before the final match, realizing, trying to find out. The next 3 books were socio-political thrillers, and that also marked my increasing involvement in politics. Then a book followed, a parenting book from a dad's perspective. That was when I became a dad and I wanted to experience firsthand the joys of fatherhood. So that was a book called Daddy. Now, in the last 7 or 8 years, India has seen a massive change where, yes, history is being rewritten, and that has a positive side to it and a slightly negative side also to it. But what brings me to the topic, I grew up in a place called Jamshedpur, where one would invariably find a Birsa Chowk, a Birsa Nagar, in fact the whole of Jharkhand. In fact, Ranchi has a Birsa Munda airport. But whenever one would like to dwell a little more into the character, there was an absolute dearth of information about the character. And that is what made me realize that history has always been written from the point of view of rulers, but at least if you look at the freedom struggle of India, there has always existed a parallel subaltern movement which predates the officially recorded freedom movement. So while yes, today marks the death anniversary, today marks the death anniversary of the 1857, the Mangal Pandey who led the 1857 War of Independence. The thing is, tribal and subaltern wars for independence have been going on from 1784 and often complemented the mainstream freedom movement. So there was a lady called Helen Lepcha from Sikkim who basically carried out a non-cooperation movement, who followed Gandhi, the principles of Gandhi, and followed the non-principle movement in a place called Kurseong. She was instrumental in getting Subhash Chandra Bose flee from his internship in Kurseong. So in many ways, this parallel movement was complementing the mainstream movement, but it invariably went unrecorded. I recently wrote a book on Birsa Munda. Now, many of the issues which Birsa Munda had to deal with in his lifetime are issues which are still, which are issues that the Adivasi and tribal population of the country are still grappling with. In a short span of 25 years, The number of times Birsa Munda evolved in a different avatar was absolutely extraordinary. But the lack of knowledge of Birsa Munda today among the descendants of his clan or among the Adivasi population invariably has been playing into the hands of politicians. And invariably, despite massive changes which have taken place over the last 1 decade, if you look at the primary reasons for the Naxal movement in India, or in fact one of the other issues which plagues the Adivasi society, which is forced or enticed conversions, one of the key reasons that propelled or which actually aggravated the issue was the vast disparity which used to exist. Thankfully, in the last 10 years or so, much of that disparity has been addressed. How has that been addressed? Well, when you have sanitation cover increasing from 40% to 100%, invariably the biggest beneficiaries of that increased sanitation cover is the tribal population, because that tribal population is at the bottommost pedestal of that pyramid which exists in society. When you have electrification cover, almost every village covered by electrification, obviously the biggest beneficiary is the tribal population. Road connectivity again benefits them. So even at this point of time, somewhere, if certain political entities still encourage a sense of victimhood, that needs to be addressed through cultural empowerment, and that is where invoking the cultural legacy of the tribal freedom movement of India becomes very important. So coming back to my journey, the first such movement was reported around the year 1784. Tilka Maji had led that movement, the Santhal, in the areas around Bhagalpur. The issues were the same: the encroachment of Jal, Jungle, Zameen, which is water, forest and land. And invariably the same issues plague many parts of the tribal population today. From the start of the 19th century, it is no coincidence that right from the northeast to the south, simultaneous movements were taking place almost across the country. Two brothers, Santhal brothers, Siddho Kano, led a movement in 1855, which is known as the Santhal Insurrection, which in many ways was the precursor to the 1857 War of Independence. Now, the important thing over here is to contemporize the issues and the characters of these movements. A Birsa Munda today need not fight the Britishers because the conditions are different. Today the villagers, the tribals are empowered sufficiently with facilities which they did not have previously. A Birsa Munda today could be a person who is disillusioned with the existing political system and brings out a new thought process. He could be somebody who is tormented in the corporate world and decides to, against all odds, pursue a new line of action. So I think while many of the issues of yesteryears remain the same, the important point over here is that the Adivasi population needs to know that they have an empowered legacy, the leadership which has been provided over the last 200 centuries by a spate of Adivasi leaders, hold them in good state. And finally, if I start with Tilka Maji in 1784, the last of the tribal leaders before India became independent and whose contribution remains unparalleled, is a person called Jaipal Munda, who many of you may not have heard of. Jaipal Munda was one of the most exceptional speakers of the Constituent Assembly, right from his views against prohibition to democracy that has existed within the Adivasi community over the last many centuries. All of these issues have been covered threadbare in his speeches, and his speeches, if you look, I will bring you all of these because I have just worked on a book called The Great Tribal Warriors of Bharat, which is the collection of 17 or 18 different stories of tribal freedom fighters.